Okay, this is not the ideal notes setup, but I'm going to give it a whirl here and hopefully get my document reader hooked up at school. So this will be a little bit more professional next time. So you need your notebook for the notes you're going to take today, and you need something to write with. And if you are someone who likes to make your notes colorful and creative and kind of add your own flair, then you can definitely do it with these Flair pens or other pens that you have, or something to take notes with. So in my notebook, I am not using my first page. I usually set my first page up to be a table of contents. So I'm going to go on to the second page. And I also don't like to write on the back of the page because sometimes the pens do kind of bleed through a little bit. So one of our objectives or learning targets this week is for you to learn about conflict in literature. And I think that for most of you, conflict should be a review. You should have learned about types of conflicts in the past. But I do want to review that with you. And then our 8th grade standard for conflict is really looking at how conflict impacts the theme of the story, analyzing conflict in a deeper way, looking at how characterization is revealed through conflict. So you need to know the basics about conflict, but then what we do in 8th grade is much more extensive than just identify the type. So you need to know that conflict is the problem or problems in the story. Usually the protagonist or the main character faces some sort of struggles or problems. And usually there's more than one conflict in a story. However, there's often just one main conflict, and then there are some side or secondary conflicts as well. So you should also be familiar with plot structure. So I want you in your notes to draw a little plot diagram that looks something like that. And we should know the different parts of the plot, but when we're talking about conflict, you need to know that often conflict is introduced in the rising action. So that's this part of the plot diagram where things start to pick up. The exposition, this part, is where you just meet the characters. Sometimes the conflict is alluded to, but usually there's not much about the conflict in the exposition. Right here is the climax in a traditional plot. And this is where conflict is typically faced head on by the character. Then this part is the falling action. And usually the conflict is worked out in the falling action. And then in the end, the conflict is resolved in the resolution. So when you're thinking about conflict, that's typically what it looks like in the plot of a story or a book or a TV show or a movie. Conflict is important. Every story needs conflict. You don't really have a story if you don't have conflict going on. It makes the story interesting. And then really looking at why conflict is important. Conflict often leads to a theme or message. So the way a character handles conflict, the way they deal with the problems in the story can often lead to a message or moral or a theme that the reader can take away. Also, conflict often reveals character traits. So you see how a character faces a conflict and what they do when they're struggling. So it reveals character traits. And that is something we will talk about a lot with the short stories that we read this trimester, and also the short story that you will ultimately write later on this trimester. So you do need to know the different types of conflict. So there is one internal conflict, and we call that character versus self. And you may have learned it before as person versus self or man versus self. I always say character versus self. I like that it's just more like gender neutral and we're just focusing on the character in the story. So character versus self, and I know this is not showing up well, so I will also center it at the end of these notes so you can see the whole picture. I'm just not in a great setup right now, but I'm doing my best. So character versus self. So this is often when a character faces a fear that they have. So maybe they're afraid of the dark. Could be a character who's struggling with some sort of addiction. It could be that a character is just like, I'm going to call it inability to do something. So I guess it's basically a fear, phobia. They're afraid of something. They're super duper shy, something that they are struggling with internally. So that's a one type of internal conflict. Then there are multiple types of external conflicts. So you have character versus another character. And that's a pretty straightforward type of conflict. Often we would say that's like protagonist versus antagonist, if you're using professional terms, or hero versus villain. And that comes up in a lot of things that you might read. But then we also have character versus nature. And so in that, there is some sort of maybe natural disaster, a tornado, a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake, or there's some problem with animals. So a character is stranded somewhere and they face a bear, or there's just some sort of an environmental obstacle. So that would be character versus nature. Then you have character versus society. And so in that instance, there will often be a tradition, not traditional, tradition. I was thinking cultural next, so cultural expectation. Or unjust rule or law that a character faces that everyone else in society follows, and then that person wants to fight it. So that's a common type of conflict that you might come across. Then we also have character versus fate. And notice I'm starting to shorten my notes a little bit here, and that's perfectly fine. You need to make your notes readable to you and understandable to you. So I do want you to have like most of this information, but if you want to shorten things up, and you can see I really do try to shorten notes. I don't want you doing 40 minutes worth of note taking. I think that's way too much, but I do want you to know the basics and have something to refer to. So you can shorten things as you go. Just make sure you get down what's essential and that you can understand it. So character versus fate. Here you have a character that struggles against something that's like destined to be, or something out of their control. This is commonly something you will see in mythology. So if you are someone who has read a lot of Greek mythology, you have seen this type of conflict happen a bunch. Or even in, like, if you've ever seen the movie Final Destination, that's just a good example of character versus fate, where no matter what they do, they can't change the course of what happens. No spoilers. So finally, there are a couple types of conflicts that are recognized by some people, but not by everyone. And so those are character versus supernatural. So a lot of times people just put that along with character versus character. So it'd be like a supernatural being, a ghost, an alien, some sort of robotic creature or character. And then there's also character versus technology. So the more traditional types of conflict are character, nature, society, fate. And then, of course, the internal character versus self. And then some people do also consider character versus supernatural and technology as other types of conflict. So that's a little information about conflict. Hopefully it's a review for you. Here is a closer up image of the notes. And you can always pause when I'm doing this type of instruction. You can pause and take notes, or you can, freeze it here at the end and make sure you have everything that you need. So we are going to be looking at conflicts and some things that we'll be reading together this week. Make sure you have these notes done for your notebook. On Wednesday, I'm going to ask for you to hold them up and show them to me, because I want to make sure that you have the information that you need to be successful. And then later this trimester, you will be writing your own short story. And when you do that, you get to develop the conflict. So I want you to have this as a resource when you're trying to come up with what type of conflict you want in your own story and how you want your character to act and speak and think and behave during the conflict. If you have any questions, you can always email me. Otherwise, now that you're done with your conflict notes, you're going to move on to the second activity, which is doing some writing samples. So take a look at that, and I will see you soon.